available. So I'm recording now. Typical notification that anything you say on the mic or write in the chat will be part of the recording. So just keep that in mind. And yeah, let's get into it. So I'm going to go to the notes page here. And we're just going to look at a few different examples of sound in video games and, kind of talk about how that works. So we're talking about sound effects. We're also going to be talking a little bit about background sound as well in this lecture. As you guys probably are familiar, sound in video games is used to enhance immersion or the feeling of deep involvement in the game by the player or the user. I don't know if we've actually used the term immersion or immersive yet this semester, but it's an important concept in video game design, this idea of immersion. I'm realizing this background color is a little bit hard to read with that. There we go, that's a little bit better. Okay, so immersion is like the idea that we're sort of like in the game itself. And really successful games, whether it's, simple like Pong or Tetris or something like that, or some really complex, open world like involved game, both are relying on this idea of immersion, that we are sort of just like living in the game world to create the experience of the game. And sound is a big part of that. And it, from the beginning of video game design, sound is an important way of kind of like keeping us in the game world by reinforcing what we see with what we hear. Graphics, we spend the most time on graphics a lot of the time, and they get the most attention. But for user experience, sound is just as important. We're always looking to reinforce the user experience with cues that are both visual and through sound. So a few examples of when to use sound effects in a game. There should be a sound that results anytime two things in the game collide or have a collision. So that might be the player running into an enemy. It might be the enemy running into a wall. It might just be the player walking across the ground. Anytime there's two objects that are interacting with each other, we know in the real world that that would create a sound. And so in our game, we want to try to reinforce that with a sound as well. A sound should accompany any change in state of the game. So if you change the level, if you get a point, if you die, anything that changes like the overall state of the game, that should also be reinforced with some type of sound. A sound should also accompany any user input. So anytime you click on start game or quit game or retry game, anytime we do an input, even if we're not actually playing the game, if we're doing some kind of user, if we're playing with the interface somehow, there should be a sound that plays so that we know that interaction was recorded by the software. So that's what makes sound so complex, is that it's not just adding the sound of a gun shooting or a player getting splat on the ground or something like that. There's also all these little moments that we have to use sounds to reinforce to the player what's happening. So for our games, we're not going to have time really to add as much sound as we're kind of describing here. But these are sort of the three main areas that we'll be thinking about, and we'll look at in next week's lab how to add sounds in each of those areas. Okay, so let's look at how video game design has kind of developed with sound over time. So we're going to go back way early, 1972. And there aren't very many sounds in here, but pay attention to how the sounds are very similar, but they're also very distinct. And so we come to know exactly what each sound represents as we're playing the game. I don't think I've actually played anything with sound yet so far, so let me know if you don't hear this. Okay, great.
So glitchy. So glitchy.
Yeah.
La puerta cierra, cebolla.
So I think that's enough to get the idea, but you can see that there's a sound for everything that happens in the game, even though there's not a lot of things that can happen. There's a sound for when the ball hits the paddle. There's a sound for when the ball hits the top or the bottom window. They are pretty bad at Pong in this video. And there's also a sound for when the ball goes past the paddle and there's a score. So there's three different sounds. They're all kind of sound the same, but they're slightly different pitches. And so we know what happens. We could listen to this video and count the score or count how many times the player hit the ball without actually seeing anything because we know what those sounds mean. So that's very, very simple use of sound in a obviously very simple game. Fast forward a little more than a decade or almost 2 decades, Sonic the Hedgehog. We'll see in here, it's sort of more maximalist use of sound where there's sounds for everything. There's background music. There's like multiple layers of background music. And so we're starting to see, we skipped over a lot of things, but here we see this kind of next era in sound design where there's a lot of different things going on. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit to where the game starts. So that's kind of an example of this more maximalist approach to sound design where there's like overlapping different music tracks. The music changes a lot as we advance through the game into different scenes. There's sounds for every single time we collect the rings. The game is moving very fast, so a lot of these sound effects are happening at the same time. And there's also a bit of like an overlap in what you hear in the music and what you actually hear from the sound effects of things happening. So it's pretty interesting as far as how sound design is kind of developing. So we're going to jump ahead again to Half-Life from 1998. And this game is innovative in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways is also its use of sound. And the use of sound effects in general, you'll see that there's like a lot of different sound effects for all these different things that are happening. Like if you're walking on one type of ground versus another type of ground, there's a lot of ambient sound. But there's also the way they mix in the background music is really interesting, where as you get to different stages, you hear really different types of background music, and you can see that it's triggered by your progression through the game. It's not just like playing the same backing track, on loop the whole level. It's actually changing, depending on how you're playing the game and as you're kind of progressing. So this is obviously a really long video. I'm just going to play a bit of a clip, and we'll hear a few of examples of those components. Sound effects in this game are also really loud. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. But I think you could watch this whole video and pay attention just to how the sound is changing as you're going through the game, and you would learn a lot about sound design. Right there, that last transition that happened, we went from this kind of like louder, kind of like banging sound that was kind of going along with what was happening in the scene in that room with all the the vats and all these mechanical things that are happening. And then as you transition into this next phase where you're kind of sneaking through tunnels, a new soundtrack, the soundtrack changes to this more kind of like ambient, kind of menacing sound. And if you watch this video or play Half-Life, you'll see all these different sound changes that happen throughout the progression of the game. So let's keep going. So again, fast forwarding a little bit, I've showed a little bit of Braid in an earlier lecture, I think. Braid is really well known for its sound design, partly because the sound is built into the mechanic of changing time. So in this example, you'll actually hear the sound being played in reverse as the game is played in reverse. It's just a quick example of how the sound is, everything is played in reverse, including the sound. So the sound reinforces the functionality of the game. So then we fast forward a little bit longer to a more modern game from 2016, Inside. And in here, what is really interesting is how ambient sound is used. In particular, in this clip, you'll hear this sort of like heartbeat sound, which is almost like, it's almost like in film when they're playing stuff to kind of like raise your emotional awareness and things like that. The way that sound is mixed in this game, it's kind of not just playing background music, not just doing sound effects, but also adding these kind of ambient sounds that actually kind of like trigger our emotions and trigger our sort of response to what's happening in the game. So you can get the sense from that clip, you know, uh, I'll call on you in just a second, Hecam. Now we see where the backing sound and the sound effects are actually being kind of mixed together to kind of add to the tension that's happening in the scene. So there's less of a sort of like dividing line between what's music or what's sound effects or ambient sounds. They're all kind of mixed together to create this sort of ambient and kind of experience that matches the graphics and the story and everything else happening in the game. Hakem, did you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I said the game looks like Little Nightmares.
Is Little Nightmares a film or another
No,
game?
it's another game.
Oh, okay.
Little
I'm not
Nightmares
familiar with
is
that one.
very similar. It's a horror kind of platform puzzle game.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. It's a great game though. They just dropped the second one. Highly recommend.
Cool. I'll check it out. Cool. So let's see. I think that's it. So those are all the examples. Obviously, there's tons of games with different sound design that I could use as examples here. You know, this isn't supposed to be, these are the best examples of sound design, but they're just good examples of sound design that show these different qualities that we want to talk about. When you're starting to think about adding sounds into your game, this is not an exhaustive list, but things that you'll be thinking about for the games that we're creating. You have the player, you have to think about jumping, walking, attacking, dying. All these are, you know, basic components of the player. There's enemy movement and attack and dying sounds as well. There's game state changes, so the level begins, the level ends, you know, restart, anytime you're changing something about the game. Rewards, so anytime you collect an award, a reward, there should be a sound. And then, you know, if some big change happens because you collected like 100 or you got a certain score, then we can add other types of achievement sounds. And then UI, which also kind of relates to game state changes, but could be other things, different menu items or choosing different things in the menus. So this is kind of a list of what to start with as you're adding sounds to the game. You might need more stuff. You might not have all these components, but this is kind of a good place to get started. Ambient sounds. So these are also sounds that are not the direct result of some kind of user input. But as I mentioned, there's a little bit of ambiguity there these days. These would be sounds like rain, wind, traffic, police sirens, voices in the background. And these things could be related to what's happening in the game. Like as you change from one scene to the next, maybe you add some rain or wind, but they're not the direct result of, like, you know, if you click a button or if you land on an enemy or if you fall off a cliff or whatever. So ambient sounds are more for the setting, or, you know, setting the scene. We can also use sounds as cues to direct the player's attention to something. So there's a few examples of that here. Some games have voiceovers that are like literally telling the player what's going on or what they should be doing. So they might be saying like, you know, here's your quest, or here's what you need to do now. That's usually for like some kind of tutorial or something like that, or it might be more narrative components. You might hear like footsteps from another character that you can't actually see, but that would sort of alert you to the fact that was a kind of like a signal that would direct your attention somewhere else. So you might not necessarily see something on screen, but you hear a sound that lets you know that something's coming or that there's something, you know, around you. Other ambient effects like a heartbeat, like in the game Inside that we listened to, or, you know, tense music or other things like that, they might not be a direct input from the player, but they could be alerting the player to something that's happening, like you're about to get to the final boss or the last scene or some important event. So these are other things that we can think about when we're adding ambient sound or background sound to the game. So I only have one link here, the importance of sound in video games. This goes through a bunch of different examples and shows some cool stuff. You know, you guys should check that out on your own time if you're interested. But that's pretty much it for what I want to go over with sound. The sort of most important aspect of this is just our two like lists here, the types of sound effects and then the sounds of as cues. As far as when you guys are ready to do the sound lab next week, you should keep those in mind as far as, you know, thinking about what sounds you need to add to the game. So yeah, that's it. Do you guys have any questions or anything, you know, about this lecture? All right, I'm going to stop the screen recording now.